This is tape 1, side 1. Today is Sunday, May 11th, and this is the beginning of an interview with David Payne at 112 South Booth Street, Marion, Indiana. Mr. Payne was born on October 19th, 1947. My name is Ann Payne, and I will be the interviewer. Mr. Payne is my father. Mr. Payne, could you state for the recording what war you were involved in and what branch of the service you were in?
I was in the Air Force serving during the Vietnam era.
What was your rank and where did you serve?
I was a sergeant and I served in Homestead, Florida, and also in Turkey.
What type of work did you perform while in the Air Force?
I was an air policeman, which is the same as a military policeman. I worked in security, I worked K-9, and I worked base police.
Where were you born and raised?
Marion, Indiana.
What was your family background?
I was an only child. My father was killed in a car accident when I was 9, so my mother raised me.
What is your current occupation?
I'm an attorney.
At what time of the war, or at the time of the war, were you in a relationship, married, or single?
I was single.
What was your educational background before you signed with the Air Force?
I had finished Marion High School and taken one semester out at Marion College, which is now Indiana Wesleyan.
Where did you live and work during your time with the Air Force?
I stayed in the barracks the whole time I was in the service. And of course I was stationed first at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, where I took my basic, and then, as I said previously, I was down in Homestead. And the base I was at in Turkey was named Chile Air Base. It's outside of Izmir, Turkey.
What different responsibilities did you take on during the war and after?
My first assignment, I went to security police, and I was guarding B-52 bombers, which were on alert status. They weren't actually engaged in the Vietnam conflict. They were in Florida, but they were engaged in the Cold War effort, and they were on alert status. And I also guarded KC-135s. I worked at that about 10 months. It was a rather difficult job, actually. It meant a lot of standing, and you couldn't talk to anyone, and you were guarding airplanes.
In what ways did the war change your habits or activities?
I don't know so much the war, certainly the military gave me a chance to kind of grow up. I graduated from high school not really knowing what I wanted to do, and not very serious as a student. So it gave me some opportunity to kind of mature and sort things out before I eventually got on a career path.
What was the worst part about being in the Air Force?
I think probably the worst part for me was the first 10 months. I worked security work, and it was awfully hot during the daytime. The day shifts were miserable. The temperatures got very warm in South Florida, and you also, when it rained, you just had to stand out around the airplanes. You couldn't seek any shelter from the rain. You had to stand out all the time and guard aircraft, and it was a very boring, monotonous job. I was very pleased to be able to get out of that particular job. But I went from there straight into K-9, which was still another form of security, but it was a whole lot nicer as far as the duties themselves, and it was a lot shorter hours, and it was a lot better work.
How long were you at boot camp for?
1 month. That was probably a very short period for most. Typically it's 6 or 8 weeks, but I was only there 1 month. I think they were just getting guys in and getting them out as fast as possible.
What was the worst part about boot camp?
Well, that's a tough one. There were a lot of good things about boot camp. I certainly enjoyed the food. I've not really experienced balanced meals on a regular basis. A hamburger type person. Actually, the food was a pretty big improvement. Probably the worst part, though, was getting up early in the morning. And, of course, there was always a lot of shouting. There was always a lot of hit-the-deck type of thing and a lot of go-and-ho type thing. I was never overly thrilled about calisthenics, but I wasn't a 5:30 in the morning riser. And the lights would come on and people would start yelling, "Get a move on it, get a move on it." So I would call that probably as an pleasant type of memory from boot camp.
What did you learn from boot camp?
Well, it started me with a sense of responsibility, an ability to take orders and to do a job. It was certainly a highly disciplined outfit compared to what I had experienced, which was more of do what you want as you were growing up. And so it was kind of a shocker in that sense, but I think there was a lot learned there in the way of starting you on a sense of responsibility.
What did you learn while in the Air Force?
Again, the Air Force really gave me the chance to grow up and kind of chart a future going to college. I went to college while I was in the Air Force. When I was Homestead, Florida, I attended Miami-Dade Junior College. And then as I went to, when I was in Turkey, I went to University of Maryland. Probably one of the good things about the Air Force and some of the things I learned was it really broadened my horizons. I got to see parts of the world that I probably would never have experienced otherwise, and had an opportunity to travel and do things that it was quite unusual for a kid 18, 19, 20 years old.
What was the hardest part about joining the Air Force?
Well, I guess the hardest part was just leaving home and the fear of when you're going in during wartime of never knowing whether or not you're going to come back or not. There's always a certain apprehensiveness about that. I don't know that it was really so hard, but it was certainly discerning. You didn't have to worry a little about the possibility of actually being killed.
What was your main wartime activity?
Well, my activity was started out basically guarding airplanes. When I went to base police, then I was writing traffic accident reports and things like that, the same as a city cop would. I managed to get over and transfer into being a desk sergeant. That worked out to be a really great job. So I could study and attend classes and do my job all at the same time. I really liked the desk sergeant's job. And when I got out of the service, I became a desk sergeant at the University of Maryland. That worked out great too, because I could study there at the same time as I was attending school and fulfilling the job and making money.
What scared you the most about war?
I don't know that I was horribly scared of war. Actually, I volunteered for Vietnam, and my particular field was more dangerous than most. The K-9 was very dangerous duties because you were assigned to a perimeter, and you were a long ways out, and you were by yourself, and your job primarily was to detect any efforts at infiltration of the base or any intrusion of the base. So once you detected that, then you gave an alert, either a radio call that you had intruders coming through at the perimeter, or you fired off a flare or let the base know that you were having a problem out there. So that's kind of scary. You're out there by yourself. It's a dangerous position to be in, particularly in hostile territory. It's rather dangerous. That part is scary.
Did you ever run into any troubles personally?
No, because I wasn't assigned to Vietnam. Here in the base, here stateside, of course, I found people out at the perimeter of the base, and usually a fisherman that wandered off onto government property and didn't quite know where they were. In Homestead, you had to always fear a little bit the snakes and alligators out in that area, but we had canine dogs, and hopefully they would detect any kind of problems. The alligators pretty well stayed in the canals, and for the most part, the alligators weren't of any size that would really bother you. But the snakes probably could. I don't know of anyone ever getting hurt down there. The job was a very dangerous job in Vietnam, but stateside it wasn't so bad. In Turkey it was fine. I would walk at night and occasionally find jackal would be walking behind me 15 or 20 feet. That always kind of scared me a little bit when I turn around and find a jackal right behind me. But usually I don't know of them ever hurting anyone or bothering anyone.
What's a jackal?
Jackal's like a little dog. It's about a 30-pounder or so, 20, 30-pound dog. A light animal, but it's a wild animal. And they come up almost like a coyote or something following you at night. And when it's dark out there and you turn around and find one of these things stalking you almost, it really does, it can frighten you a little bit. But by and large, the canine duty I enjoyed immensely. And it was it was very good work, partly because I always enjoyed working with dogs.
Did you ever run into any troubles working with the dogs?
Well, I had a dog try and attack me once. I also got bit by a dog once in the kennel area. But my own dog tried to attack me once when he had grabbed a rodent, and I think it was a rat, and he was trying to eat it. And he was literally punching it down, and I grabbed him by the throat and was trying to squeeze him to make him let go. When he finally let go of it, he turned on me and went after me, so that was very frightening. And he was a big dog and quite a mean dog. But fortunately, I wasn't hurt.
Did you ever get attached to any of the dogs you trained?
Yes, I was attached to all of them. I had 3 dogs that I worked with, and I was very close to all 3 of them.
What kind of training were you given for this job?
Actually, mine was all on-the-job training. There are schools for the military police and the air police that they can go to for a couple of months that gives them specialized training, but we had manuals and we just kind of learned as we went. The on-the-job training was a popular way of getting people up to steam when there was a war on. They were trying to crank troops out as quickly as possible.
Did you know anybody that was killed or wounded in war?
Had a friend in high school that was killed. Had a good friend that was a roommate that I always felt badly about because he did not want to go to Vietnam. His name was Bob Prest. He was from Garland, Texas. And I wanted to go to Vietnam. And I encouraged him to volunteer with me to go. And as it turned out, they sent him to Vietnam and didn't send me. And then later I heard that he was shot up rather badly. So I always felt a little bad about that.
What did you like and dislike about your experiences in the Air Force?
Well, I certainly enjoyed the opportunity to travel, the opportunity to broaden my horizons, the opportunity to seriously pursue my education, which I hadn't really thought too seriously about prior to going in the service. Actually, after I went in the service, it took about a year or so before I got back in the swing of trying to do something about going to class. In fact, maybe a little longer than that. And then I started with a junior college and went there for 1 semester. By the time I had finished at the semester at Miami-Dade Junior, I was getting my assignments to go to Turkey, or I'd gotten my assignment to go to Turkey, and I actually wanted to stay in Florida at that point. I wanted to just go ahead and finish out my 4 years, but that wasn't possible. As it turned out, the opportunity to go to Turkey opened up opportunities for travel that were enormous. I went through Europe twice. I went to Greece. I went to Russia. I did a lot of traveling in Europe and Asia.
What special rules or conventions did you have to follow?
Well, you got your usual military stuff. You know, you've got to be dressed. Probably the air police was the spit and shine of the Air Force, meaning your boots had to be polished and your shoes had to be polished, and you had to have a neatly pressed uniform. So you had a lot of rules. In fact, the rules are kind of constraining at times. I never liked the fact that they had quite so much control over me, but I had to abide by it. I got along pretty well in the military for the most part.
Did you develop friendships during your training or your activities?
I did, and I had very close friends in the military, and ironically, I've never kept in touch with any of them. There was a fellow named Ed Higgins that went to basic training with me at Lackland. We also went to Homestead at the same time, and we were assigned to Turkey at the same time. Much of our 4 years, he and I were roommates, and when we got out, we pledged that we would, stay in touch and see each other, and in reality, we've never seen each other since then.
What were your family and friends' reactions about you joining the Air Force?
I don't know. That's kind of hard to say. When you're kind of vacillating and don't have a whole lot of direction with where you're going with your life, the military is a great opportunity. And it was an opportunity at that time because there were kids from all walks of life in the military. And it was kind of a great equalizer. You had a chance to compete on a fairly even keel with everybody else. So it's hard to say what their attitudes were. We were in a war, and when I went in 1966, it was still a war well supported by the American public That wasn't true necessarily by the time I got out in 1970, but at least the first couple of years I was in until about 1968, there was a lot of support for the war, and I think generally there was support for the war throughout, but there was, we had a lot of rioting and things in the early 70s and even late 60s that kind of put a damper on the service in Vietnam. It was a shame because the guys there did a good job, and they did what they were asked to do, and they fought for their country. And at the time, I thought that the people that were going to Canada were traitors. I thought that those that were protesting were wrong, and I thought that Jane Fonda was very wrong in going to Hanoi. I was very upset with her at the time and thought she should have been prosecuted as a criminal.
How did you feel about the war?
I supported the war. I supported the war throughout. In fact, when Jimmy Carter ran an amnesty to the people that went to Canada, I was very disappointed in that decision. I supported the war because my country was at war, and therefore I was called upon to do service. And ironically, even though I enlisted in the Air Force, it was pretty much acknowledged that the kids of my generation were going to serve. There were exceptions, and of course you could get military deferments, but sooner or later you probably were going to be serving in the military. And part of my decision to go to the Air Force is I wanted to avoid being drafted in the Army and didn't want to serve in the Marines, which were the more gung-ho of the bunch. And I thought, well, this one's where I can probably further my education at some point in time. I felt like it was a little more professional than some of the others, which were more of the, I won't say the grunt organizations, but the ones that were a little more physical in their demands. The Air Force was very book learning at the time. We went to a lot of classes. And in fact, basic training, I was there for 30 days, and we probably only did calisthenics about 10 of the 30 days. Most days we spent our days in classrooms.
Did you ever worry that our side might not win the war?
Well, I'm not sure if our side did win the war. We kind of walked out of there in defeat because we didn't win the war. We didn't lose the war either, but certainly I wasn't worried about the Vietnamese ever coming here and attacking our homeland. I wasn't terribly worried about the domino effect at the time, which was common theory that if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, then they would all go. And I think we had problems, of course, in Cambodia and Laos at the same time, and I think that kind of spurred on that domino effect. But the reality is, no, I didn't worry about losing. We kind of lost the faith to win. The American public, I think, decided after a certain period of time that this was a war that wasn't one that we should pursue, and so we just kind of walked away from it. And we walked away to some degree almost in defeat. I think that's the way a lot of people look at it. I'm very disappointed now hearing former Defense Secretary McNamara described it, how early on they knew that it was a war that could not be won, and yet they kept pumping troops in. We had our big buildup in that war in about 1965 under LBJ, and we got up to like 500,000 men serving in Vietnam, and at that point, according to McNamara today, they recognized that the war was not one that could be won. And you wonder, why did so many people have to lose their lives after that, when the authorities or the people that were making the decisions had already given up on it.
How did joining the Air Force change your mental outlook on life?
It gave me a more disciplined outlook. It afforded me opportunities for an education that I don't truly think I had because I wasn't ready for them, wasn't disciplined enough for them previously. It certainly helped me with the GI Bill after the service in providing for some funds for my college. It also, I think, put me on course with being a policeman, so that when I went to the University of Maryland, it was a natural thing to do, and I needed to help fund my education to some degree, to become a cop, and to help support myself in that fashion.
What is your most memorable experience while in the Air Force?
Well, that's a tough one. I have so many experiences. I went on one call for a suicide once. That was one that I'll never forget. That was a tough one. And for a 19-year-old guy to show up at a suicide or something like that as the policeman on scene. had a lot of experiences that I'll just remember. I remember traveling. That was certainly a great experience. I remember I spent a week in Moscow once. That was a fantastic experience. I have very fond memories of my visit there. The most beautiful place in the world that I've been to was Lucerne, Switzerland. I'll never forget that. It's got a huge lake there alongside the city and with mountains behind it. I liked Austria. I thought it was a great country, a neat place. I loved the people in Italy. They were very friendly. In fact, when we travel on trains, I typically would find a car with Italian family in it to sit next to, because at some point there would be a big basket pulled out with food, and they would be passing out sandwiches, and they always included whoever sat next to them or was in the car with them. So I gave many free sandwiches courtesy of Italians that didn't know my name, knew nothing about me. They were very nice people, and they went out of their way enormously to try and help you if you were traveling. Probably, I had a lot of good experiences in that sense.
What was your most humorous experience?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think one of the ones that I found funny was I was mowing the grass at the kennel one day, and we have a large area where the dogs have been buried that had died, that was euthanized over the years. And they had like wooden blocks that were painted with the names of the dog on them. And they would be like Caesar, Duke, King, etc. And as I was mowing this area, I took one row of these markers off and set them aside, and then I put them back on. And the sergeant who was over me, and I had not made sergeant at that point, yelled out, "What are you doing, Payne?" And I said, "Well, I'm moving these grave markers over, and then I'm putting them back, because I know." He said, "I'll just take them all off. I know where they all go." I said, "Oh, okay." So I took, I don't know, 50, 75, 100 of these markers off and put them in one pile. And then when I finished mowing, I went back and I told the sergeant, I said, "Sergeant, I finished mowing. Do you want to show me where all these grave markers go?" He said, "Oh, sure." And he walked out and proceeded to load up a bunch of these markers under one arm. And with his other hand, he was walking along, dropping one marker on each grave. Obviously, it made no difference to him whether King was in that hole or whoever was there. He was just putting one grave marker on each graveside. And I kind of thought that was funny at the time, because I was awfully dumb to not realize beforehand, before I ever went to get him, that he didn't have any idea where those dogs were individually buried. He just was putting markers out. So I don't know how funny it is to others, but it certainly struck me as odd at the time that I was such a jerk that I didn't think ahead on that.
What was your most scariest moment?
Scariest moment? Well, I don't think I had too many. I never had anybody shooting at me. We found an intruder or two that maybe didn't belong on the flight line, and then we had a term for that called jacking them up. We called for a SAT team to arrive, and they were a team of 3 guys, and so we basically took that person into custody. I don't think I ever had anything where anyone ever physically accosted me or anything of that sort.
Did you have any memories that were painful or sad that you can remember?
Well, I think the era was, there was a lot of tension about Vietnam, and some people wanted to go, others did not. And I don't know if it's a sad memory or just a slight guilt feeling, but I've always felt a little guilty about Bob Press, because I know that he did not want to go to Vietnam, and I know that I'm the one that encouraged him to go. And supposedly I was going to go with him, and as it turned out, he got the assignment and I didn't.
How did you change when you came back home?
I think I matured a lot. When I came back home and I started college, I was a serious student. My party days were pretty much behind me. I wasn't interested in, I was interested in getting the job done in school, and from that time on, I made outstanding grades and was a serious student. So I think my whole attitude changed considerably. When I came back, there were a lot of guys in fraternities and things of that sort, those things didn't interest me at all. I wanted to get the studies in and go about my business. And I worked when I was in college. I worked midnight shifts as a policeman, then I worked and I studied during the day. And I learned to cram very little bits of sleep in throughout and got by very well on 5 hours of sleep, which I'm still able to do pretty well. That time was even more different because the 5 hours would come at an hour and a half to 2 hour intervals. I mean, they'd pick up an hour and a half or two of sleep and then go to class and come back later that day and catch another hour or two.
What did you think about the enemy during the Vietnam War?
Well, ironically, I never really had any great sense of hatred for the enemy. And if I had been sent to Vietnam, I would have done my job. But it would have been more of a matter of either I kill him or he's going to kill me. I didn't feel like I would want to go out and slaughter the enemy. I never felt like that at all. If I were there and the enemy were coming past my point and I was supposed to stop them, I would have simply done the job as best I could.
How would you describe the way the war and joining the Air Force changed your life and those of others around you?
Helped me grow up. That was certainly the big factor. Gave me a better sense of responsibility, and it also taught me better eating habits, better personal hygiene. I learned that you have to shave every day and you have to do certain things that, otherwise, well, when I get to it, I would do it. But had to keep a close haircut and things like that. It certainly, it had a dramatic effect on my life. For the most part, I would say it was a very good effect, and I think it's been beneficial. I think it would be beneficial to most kids today to serve in the military, but that's not the way it seems to be going.
What was your favorite place to travel?
Favorite place? Well, I liked England. I thought that was nice. I liked Germany. I did not like France, particularly Paris. I liked Greece. That was pretty neat. I kind of liked Turkey, but Turkey was a backward country. Probably, if you had anything to compare with here, it might be some of the smaller villages in Mexico. And you go 25 miles outside of the larger cities in Turkey. When I was there, they did not have rural electrification. So they didn't have any power. They were using basically kerosene lanterns or something, kerosene lights at night. A very poor country. I like the Turkish people very well, though. They were nice people. They worked hard. At times I almost felt badly for them because the per capita income in Turkey when I was there was about $300 a year. And I made about $350 a month. So I made as much money in 1 month as the typical Turk would make all year. And they had a very hard life. It was a lot of manual labor. They didn't have a lot of equipment. They farmed fields, cotton, and things with pretty much by hand. But the Turkish people were very nice. I just enjoyed traveling and experiencing things that I probably will never experience again, at least on a long basis. If I have an opportunity to travel, it's most likely going to be on a short-term basis, not to live there.
Did you find it difficult to learn new languages?
I didn't learn that much Turkish. A lot of the Turks I dealt with would speak English. I dated a school teacher there who spoke very good English, so she was Turkish. And I learned phrases and little bits and pieces of Turkish, and there were very few of the guys that actually learned enough of the language to be fluent. We learned enough to be courteous and to speak bits and pieces and say hello and thank you and things like that, but not to say very much.
What did you find particularly different about the cultures you encountered?
Well, Turkey at that time was somewhat modernized. Kemal Ataturk brought the Turkish people out of the Ottoman Empire and he brought them out of the control of the Greeks, who took over, I believe, in 1918 with the folding of the Ottoman Empire. You had a Greek occupation of Turkey. He drove the Greeks out in about 1922, started modernizing that country. So they did have some equipment there. They had they were working on the education system, and they were actually making considerable improvement on the rights of women, although there were still a fair number of the older women that wore the veils when I was there. When I say fair number, half or so, you go into the cities and half of them did. In the villages, they all did. In the villages, the women, you could not talk to them. They were almost like property. And I went to the villages and we talked to the men and had coffee. Well, they didn't have coffee so much. They had tea, called it chai, with the Turkish men. But the women's status was very poor. The education level generally was poor. There was a lot of hard work that the Turks had to perform, and it was a very impoverished country.
This is tape 1, side 2, continuing interview with David Payne. How long did you stay in one spot?
The longest I was anywhere was about 2.5 years in Homestead, Florida. And that's kind of a long time, actually. Typically, they were moving people about every 2 years or so. So when I got my assignment to Turkey, I didn't quite have 18 months remaining on my tour, on my enlistment. And they sent me anyway, and I actually, when I say it was in Turkey 18 months, it was really closer to about 17 months. So that was about it. But I only had 2 assignments the whole time I was in it. It was Florida and Turkey.
Was it difficult to move around a lot?
Well, it wasn't moving around a lot, but it did come at an inconvenient time as far as the Turkey assignment. I'd just gotten settled into the college, the junior college there, and finished my first semester when I got my assignment to move. And that was kind of inconvenient because I liked it down there very well by that point. Thought there might even be a possibility I'd spend my entire 4 years down there. I'm sure that it was hard on the men that were married to move around, and of course Vietnam was not an assignment you could take spouses on, so those that had to go to Vietnam, now those were short terms of duty. They were 1 year, was all they were serving. And depending on where you were sent as to how long you had to stay, Turkey was an 18-month tour. Kind of the harder, the more isolated the assignment, the shorter the term. If you got a tour of duty to Germany, you're typically there, I think, at least 2 years. So if they sent you to a pretty nice place and comfortable place, they kept you longer, and if they sent you to a more isolated or more difficult place like the Vietnam assignment, it was a fairly short assignment.
What all did you do in each of the places you were stationed?
I think I've covered all those things, but we'll run through it one more time since we have time remaining on our interview. Well, when I went to basic, of course, that was just learning the military system, learning the ranks, and learning the rules of military life. You talk about the kinds of things you come across there. I can recall, well, first of all, I was only there about 2 weeks or so, and I got word that my best friend had committed suicide. So I had to go to my sergeant and ask if I could make a telephone call home and talk to the family. And of course, they allowed me to do that. But that was kind of tough because he was a good friend of mine, and I had been best man at his wedding literally 6 months earlier. And he was an outstanding student, and for whatever reason, and I don't think we know to this day, he took his own life. So that happened while I was in basic training. I guess I could tell you a little bit more about basic training. We had a barracks. It was an open bay barracks with a line of beds on it, which was bunk beds, top bunk and bottom bunk, and a small chest that we had to keep all of our clothing and everything in. The one thing that was striking about basic training was we were paid almost immediately after getting there. Now, I was only making when I started in the military, I was only making $66, $67 a month. Very low pay. But of course, they were providing my food, my clothing, well, at least my military clothing, and my housing. But it was very, very low pay. I didn't have a car until I got down to Homestead, and I bought one when I got ready to start school down there. At that point, I had made sergeant, was making a little over $300 a month. But the military pay didn't seem to be a problem, particularly in basic training, because we didn't have any place to spend it. They wouldn't let us go anywhere. We couldn't. They kept giving us money about every 10 days, and we hadn't spent any money at all. They'd give us $15 or $18 or $20, and then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later or 10 days later, they'd give us another $20, and I hadn't spent the first 20. I still had it laying in my locker. So there wasn't much opportunity to spend money. We only got off the base one time, and that was the Sunday before we left. We were allowed to go into San Antonio for several hours. Of course, most everything was closed that day, so there wasn't a whole lot to do. But we did walk in, or we did get in, and we walked around town a little bit, got to see a little bit of the town, and then I was assigned out, and of course I took a short leave right after basic training, and then went down to Homestead. Homestead, at that time, was a Strategic Air Command base, and it was a nice base. It was a very pretty area. In fact, the Homestead community was a very nice area at that time. And I say that at that time because I've since gone back and it's kind of deteriorated over the years. But at that time, it was a nice kind of a semi-retirement area and a very pretty base. Had a nice golf course there, which I didn't play golf, but it didn't matter. It was still a nice place to be. It was a good assignment. However, it was also an assignment where a lot of generals would fly in because they did want to go to South Florida and play golf. So our unit had to be the one that was kind of the spit and polish of the Air Force. We had to have our barracks in very good shape and very clean and very orderly so that generals and others could come through and inspect. And they did that sometimes on very, very short notice. So I kind of liked Homestead, and I certainly liked it after I got into college down there. Even though it was a junior college, community college, it worked out pretty well, and I got the same rates as the state students did, which was $10 a credit hour. So I wasn't paying hardly anything to go to college down there, and was getting some credits there. I was disappointed, though, when I had to leave there. I wanted to go to Vietnam earlier, and I didn't get the assignment, and then all of a sudden I started settling into the Homestead area, and I bought a car and was able to get to and from school. I loved the canine work down there, which was a big improvement over the security police type work. We worked very few hours. We worked 3 days of sundown to midnight, and then we worked 3 more days of midnight to sun up. Well, sundown in South Florida in the summertime is about 8 o'clock or later, actually. And at 9 o'clock, you only worked then until midnight. Then you were off for 3 days, and then you worked midnight to sun up, which is about 5:30 or so in Florida, in the summertime at least. It comes very early. And then we had 3.5 days off. We came back after 3 days. We came back that evening shift, and it was really a very short assignment as far as time-wise. I suspect I was working less than 30 hours a week. And that was a big improvement than when I was in the base police, or not the base police, but the security police. You worked 3 days of 3 to 11, and then you worked 3 days 11 to 7, and then you worked 3 days of 7 to 3, and then you had 3 days off. And you worked a lot more hours, and those were very difficult conditions because you were expected to stand up the whole time. Now, after dark, most of the guards would sit on the fire extinguishers and at least sit down for part of the time. Most of the guards after dark would carry little radios in their pocket, which they weren't supposed to have, and they had them tucked in their ears, so they had something to kind of pass the time by. But you were standing around an awful lot of time and not talking to anybody and just simply guarding the aircraft. It was a very, very boring assignment, and one that a lot of guys simply did not like. The day shifts were very hot. There's a rainy season down there that you it rains about every afternoon, and you get a short shower, and all you can do is stand there and get wet, and then you still got to stand the rest of your shift. The only good thing about day shifts when you're working security was that when you got off that third day shift, then you had 3 days off. So that was kind of nice. But when I worked in the security aspects, it was probably around 42 hours a week. I think if you took all the hours and divided it by 4, you had 4 shifts there. I think that's what it came out to, because you had 3 days of each shift plus you had 3 days off. So you had an awful lot of time that you had to work. It was a very difficult, monotonous duty. And just dealing with the boredom was probably the toughest part. They didn't get real excited. You weren't supposed to carry the small radios, but they did get real excited because usually it was a sergeant coming around, and he kind of knew you had a radio anyway, because 2 years ago when he had the job, he had a radio too. When you worked out in K-9, they never bothered you at all. They were almost half afraid to come out because they were afraid that your dog might get loose. And that's been known to happen too if they came out unannounced. But sometimes we did let our dogs run loose out there. Whether we were supposed to or not, we did it. A lot of guys did it. And the K-9 was really great duty though. It was and if you loved dogs, it was even better. For those of us who cared a lot about dogs, you learned a lot about dogs. You learned how to train them, how to work with them, and you had kind of a best friend there. So then, when I went to Turkey, I started out in K-9, and I worked that for a few months in Turkey. 3 or 4 months, I was a shift commander, and I had, I think around 6 or 8 guys under me, each with K-9 units. But there wasn't very much rank in Turkey, and a sergeant over there was kind of an important person. You go to a big base and they're not very important at all because there's a lot of sergeants. But at that time, when you went to a small base, and there was only about 2,000 airmen or Air Force personnel at Chile Air Base, and it was almost the same number of Turkish. It was a joint Turkish-American Air Base. There was almost that number of Turkish military as well. Since there wasn't much rank there, my sergeant stripes really enabled me to have a much better job in base police. So I decided I would go over to base police, and then once I got there, I worked the patrol for a while and worked in a car, and decided that I really would rather be the desk sergeant. So I asked to be transferred to the desk sergeant, and then I went ahead and started my classes with the University of Maryland. That worked out very well. I could only take 1 class at a time. They would bring a professor in from Germany who was assigned with the University of Maryland, and we could get 1 class in about 6 or 8 weeks. I guess it was 8 weeks, I think. And he would teach 2 courses, like an American history course and something else, and you could take those, either go to class 2 nights a week and take 1 class, or you could take both classes and go 4 nights a week. I took business law, history, and English and various other courses in Turkey, and that's actually why I ended up going to the University of Maryland when I got out. I decided, well, I've already completed about a year while I was in Turkey, so I would just stay with them and go ahead and finish up. But Turkey was a really nice assignment. I was able to pursue my education. I remember on one occasion we had guys getting off to go play basketball, and I went to, the base commander had an open door policy. If you had a problem, you could go in and talk to him, and I went in one time and said, the guys get off to play basketball. I think I should be able to get off, at least on occasion, to go to my class. And so he sent word back that I would be excused for all my classes. And from that point on, I was allowed to go to every class I wanted to go to. I went to all my classes, and I never missed a class after that. It really worked out great because we had a rotating shift, but when I was working the evening shift, I still ended up getting off for an hour and a half or whatever it was to attend my class. I can't remember where all we were now. We were talking about our assignments and things like that. It's kind of hard to say what my best assignment was, but certainly base police was kind of a nice assignment, and the desk sergeant job was a very nice assignment. There wasn't too much that went on in Turkey in the way of problems in with the base police end of it. I got along well. I worked alongside the Turkish military police and got along just great with them. You talked earlier about funny stories. We did have one there that was kind of a novelty. We had two guys work the gate each time. One guy's American, one guy's Turkish, and whoever happened to come up to the gate with it happened to be an American, the American cop would go over and talk to him, and if it was a Turkish person, the Turk would go over and talk to him. And anyway, the Turk started playing quick draw with the American at the gate, and he was pulling his gun on him in a fashion that was indicating quick draw type, and then he was laughing about it and just seemed to be having a good time with it. Well, the American cop became a little concerned that, he's getting kind of ridiculous. This guy might actually shoot me accidentally or whatever. So when the Turkish commander came, the American cop told him, hey, tell him to stop drawing his gun on me. I know he's just having fun, he's just playing around, but I feel really uneasy about that. And the Turkish guy the Turkish commander slapped the soldier around and told him not to and just berated him something awful. So it was kind of a strange experience, and really, at times, the Turks could be almost childlike in their thought processes, and yet, when you hear the Turkish fighting in, like Korea particularly, they were very fierce fighters, and they were legendary in their pursuits there. They were so feared by the North Koreans that when the North Koreans were invading, they would find out where the Turkish units were and would pass around them so they didn't have to confront them head on. But at many other times, the Turks seemed very childlike. We finished? Oh, all right. I can recall when I would go to town in Izmir, and they didn't have, like a guy coming up to shine your shoes, a kid would want to shine your shoes. You make a deal. You have to deal with them all the time on how much you're going to pay. And you make a deal that you're going to pay them 20 cents or whatever it happened to be. They would shine one shoe, and then they'd want to try and up the price on you. So that was always kind of aggravating. And it was the same deal, not only with the kids that you might be dealing with, but the adults as well. You could be in a taxi. I was in a taxi in Ankara once, which is the capital of Turkey, and the cab driver and I had negotiated a price, and then we got about halfway to where I wanted to go, and he started trying to raise the price on me. And I said, no, I told you 10 lira. I told you, well, it would have been about 85 cents. I told you you'd take me there for 10 lira. You agreed to that. And finally, he actually was beginning to frighten me. So when he stopped in traffic, I jumped out of the cab and I ran over to a Turkish military officer and I said, this fella is trying to up the price on me. And the Turkish military officer, which the military over there is much like police here, they exercise civilian control just as much as they do military. And he went over and told the cab driver, you will not raise the price on him. If you agreed to the 10 lira, you will take him there for 10 lira. So I got back in the cab, and all the guy could do, he didn't speak any English or very little English up to that point, but he did speak enough that we negotiated the price. But after that, all he could say was, God damn it, God damn it, God damn it, and he just kept that up the whole way. It's kind of a funny one. But by and large, Turkey was an interesting country. When I went to Istanbul, it was very crowded. I recall that, and I recall crossing the Bosphorus there on a boat and getting off and just finding huge numbers of people. But it was interesting because you would hear the chants from the mosque, and you would hear that they have Ramadan, which is a religious period that lasts for several days, that they pray 5 times a day. It was a very interesting experience because the cultures are so different. It's kind of the Middle Eastern culture is so much different than what we experience here. I can recall seeing Turkish soldiers holding hands as they walked down the street, and that really struck me as odd. In fact, I'm thinking, hey, these guys are a couple gays, And that's not the case at all. That's just a custom in Turkey for men to hold hands, just like women once did here when they walked down the street. Then I can also recall riding a subway in Soviet Union, in Russia, and taking out some chapstick and putting it on my lips, and having everybody immediately turn and look at me, and I realized that they think I'm putting lipstick on. So I put it back in my pocket, and I was only using chapstick at the time. That was a product that they at that time were at least unfamiliar with in that form. I don't know what they did to put on their lips to stop the chapping. But I know that they certainly didn't use chapstick as I used it anyway. We had another advantage in the Air Force in that we could take military hops, and that was kind of an interesting case once where we had been military hops to get on a military airplane and fly wherever they're going for no charge. I had taken a military hop up to England and was in the process of coming back, and my good friend Ed Higgins and I were traveling together. We were working our way through Europe, having a great time as we went. We ran into a former college student that I had, was friends with in London, and we saw her at Buckingham Palace, and I said, "Don't I know you?" And it turned out she was a former student at Marian College that I attended class with. So we ended up kind of following them back through Europe, and they were on a bus tour, and we ultimately ended up in Rhine-Main Air Force Base at Frankfurt, Germany, and we were trying to get a military hop back to Greece. We were pretty much out of money, and I had enough money to get there by commercial airline, but that was about it, and I would have been broke after that. And I decided that I could save a little money if I could fly to Greece, and I was almost sure I could get a military hop out of Greece to Turkey. My friend, on the other hand, didn't want to pay. Ed Higgins did not want to pay for the commercial airline flight to Greece, so instead he hung around an extra day or two and then got the idea that he could get probably catch a military hop out of Tarragona, Spain. Well, the scary thing of that was he was going further away. But anyway, he did that. He took a military aircraft out of Frankfurt, Rhine-Main, out of Frankfurt, Germany, and went to Tarragona, Spain. Then he picked up another air hop to Lebanon, and eventually worked his way back to Turkey. But it was kind of a bizarre thing. I came the more direct route and came on back, and he was kind of hopping around. I think he actually had to call at some point and extend his vacation time. So the other thing I probably would tell you is that even though we didn't make a lot of money in the military, we certainly managed to save a fair amount of money. When I got out of the service, I had $2,300 saved. When in Turkey, they had a savings program that if you would put a certain amount in savings, they would allow you to draw 10% interest, and that was an enormous interest rate. They were trying to encourage military personnel to save their money rather than spending it overseas. So I put about half my pay for the last year into savings, not quite half, but almost. And I was able to save an enormous amount of money while I was in service, which at the time was a lot of money. It wouldn't be so much today, but $2,300 in 1970 was quite a bit of money. So it really didn't work out that it was such a hardship. Everything was really cheap in Turkey. I could get a haircut for, 20 cents or something like that. There just wasn't a whole lot of things that you need to worry about spending money on. If you wanted to travel, you could spend money doing that, and certainly that could be expensive. But I went to Russia for a week for $225. I went with a Turkish tour, and it was my second request. When I first requested to go to Russia, the military denied my request, and the second time there happened to be a colonel that wanted to go also, so they said, sure, since the colonel's going, you can go as well. And I had a great time in Russia the week that I was there. We visited the Pushkin Museum. I went to the Bolshoi Theater. Was the only guy there wearing a gold jacket, because that's all I had. Everybody else was dressed in very conservative black suits. so I stood out considerably. I had one of those jackets that looked like a Century 21 Realtor jacket, and I was the only guy in the place dressed quite like that. It was a nice, and I saw the Lenin's tomb. That was a shocker. When I went to Lenin's tomb, I never imagined, because we were a foreign group, a Turkish tour, we got to go straight to the head of the line. Might also indicate we flew over there by Aeroflot, and on the way over we discovered that my American money wasn't going to translate too well into into Russian lira. So I actually exchanged Turkish money, which was getting a better exchange rate, for my Russian lira. And you learn that throughout, and the students particularly learned as they were traveling through Europe which currencies to carry and which ones to exchange, because certain countries had a preference for certain currencies. Now in Russia, they really wanted the American dollar, and you could buy, the people would offer to buy your clothes and things like that, and they wanted anything that was American when I was there, and they would offer you an enormous sum for it. They would also offer you a very favorable exchange rate on the street, but it was black market. And I don't think any of us that I'm aware of engaged in that, because there was a fear that you might actually be committing a crime and be in serious trouble. But they would offer you a very favorable exchange rate. When I was there, I paid about $1.10 for a ruble, and on the official exchange rate, then you could get a ruble for 25 cents on the black market. So, but anyway, Russia was a neat experience. I certainly enjoyed the week that I was there and got to see and meet people who seemed very friendly. They seemed shocked that you were an American. They seemed to, you were speaking English, and a lot of people in Russia were speaking English at that time. A lot of the younger students were all speaking English. So you could get along pretty well, at least in Moscow. We didn't leave the city. We stayed there the entire week. And I think we had a fairly free hand. I think they did mark down when we left the hotel and things like that, but I don't think that we were really watched or any problems of that sort. I think there was probably less suspicion about the Soviets at the time we were there than we would have had of them if they had been here. I think we had a greater fear of the Soviet people than the people did of us. What else we got to talk about?
I was just going to ask you, is there anything else that I should ask? Anything else you would like to share?
Well, probably the military was, as I've said several times, was a good deal for me. I wish it were as good a deal for the kids today. I'm not convinced that it is. You don't have the widespread joining that you had when I was in. Today, unfortunately, it's probably more lower economic classes that tend to gravitate toward the military, and also I think it's become somewhat more profit-minded. I think the guys and gals today that are joining are making a fairly decent wage. And in fact, maybe it was a little more service-oriented when I was in. I think the service kind of goes with the responsibility of being an American, that you ought to give something back. And to give 2 years of your life, and in my case I enlisted, so I spent 4 years. But to give 2 years of your life to the benefit of the country is really not that great a demand. Hopefully not in a way that's going to require you to give up your life, hopefully in a way that's positive for the benefit of all of our people. But I think we're past that point, and I don't think we'll ever go back to that. I don't think we'll go back to the point where we draft people and we get a better cross-section of the public. Unfortunately now I think we're just going to be hiring people to go over and fight our battles. In some cases we're getting outstanding caliber of people, in some cases I'm not convinced that we are. I think the reserves, and we're dependent much more on them today than we ever in the past were. They are very high caliber, dedicated, public-spirited citizens. Unfortunately, I think too many in the the military itself, the regulars today are probably people that have had a problem or looking for a way out. Either they had problems with the law and that kind of thing. They just didn't have their lives on order. So that's kind of where we are, and I don't think we'll ever see the period of voluntary service that we had in Vietnam and earlier periods. I think probably the glorious days of military service would have been for World War II, where you had virtually everybody committed to the war effort. When I was in and when Vietnam was occurring, we had a very high percentage of people committed to the war effort, but there were also a very lot of people that were against it. And that's kind of unfortunate, but maybe it's a war that we shouldn't have been in to begin with.
Thank you for your time and for sharing with me.